Okay, so you're recording, correct?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Happy St. Pat's Day. My name is Sandy Baird, and we're here with this VICII session on Brexit as it influences still Scotland, Ireland, and England itself. I'm here tonight to say Happy St. Pat's Day and introduce my friend to talk about Ireland, my friend Graham Clark, who I met numbers of years ago, probably a lot of years ago, although it seems like yesterday. I believe I met Graham about 1985 or 86, when he introduced me kind of to the whole issue of Ireland. I'd always thought about Ireland in some degree because I'm a Scot, and after all, the Irish and the Scots, although sometimes they don't seem to like each other very much, are really basically kind of the same people, with a big religious difference usually between the Irish, who are Catholics, and the Scots, who are a majority Protestant. But I met Graham at a seminar that he gave with numbers of his Irish friends in Montpelier. And that seminar was about how England had created these overseas areas of influence that were done by England that were very similar. And those similarities that he pointed out in that seminar were between England and Ireland, England and Palestine, and England and South Africa, which I found very interesting. And so I followed that kind of issue ever since then, about this treatment of England toward its then empire, which included the beginnings of its empire in the UK itself, in Scotland and in Ireland, and then later in Palestine and in South Africa. So Graham is here because he has worked much part of his life on the Irish situation. He knows a great deal about it. He was active in organizing what was called the McBride Principles in our state legislature. And he has a lot to say about Ireland, particularly in how it affects how Ireland has been affected and how Scotland has been affected by Brexit and will continue to be influenced by that. And I want to point out that with us tonight is Ian Stokes, who is originally from England, and he's a British man. And so I'm happy that he is here. He also is an activist on the Palestinian question. So I'm sure that he will have stuff to say. So here's Graham to begin our session. We're expecting at some point to have Greg Delanty, who is an Irish poet from Ireland, taught at St. Mike's for years, to perhaps chime in, because after all, this is a celebration of a big holiday in this country, usually, which is St. Patrick's Day, kind of the beginning of spring. Okay, so Graham, where are you?
I am in Charleston, South Carolina.
Yeah.
Yeah, making my way back to Vermont from VICII, Puerto Rico. So somebody can just alert me if and when Greg joins us, and I will not introduce him until that happens. So Sandy, thanks for the introduction. Asked me to talk a little bit about Brexit, about Ireland, and about Scotland. So here we go.
Graham, could I just intercede for 1 minute? Maybe, do you want the map?
I was just going to say, Beth, can you put a map up? Because this is all about man-made lines of division.
Got it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just as a historical note, and I didn't do any research on this, but the word gerrymander does come from British rule in Ireland, where there was if my memory serves me correctly, a British landowner whose name wasn't gerrymander. Maybe it was Mander Jerry. But anyway, the British have had a long history of borders and colonies and the like. The United States used to be part of that great empire. So as we talk today, we're talking about two islands. And to the west on the left of the map is the island of Ireland, which was partitioned by the British in the early 1920s. And there were 4 historic areas of Ireland. Ulster was the farthest to the north, and it was comprised of 9 counties. So they gerrymandered the 3 most Catholic counties because they knew that it wasn't going to be politically viable and sustainable if to have domination over the native Irish. And so the most northern county in Ireland is in the south, and that you can see on the map. So we had a partition in Ireland, became 6 counties called Northern Ireland. And by 1937, many iterations became the country of Ireland, sometimes called the Republic of Ireland. And then you have the larger island to the east, which the largest landmass is England, Scotland to the north, Wales. So Great Britain today is comprised of Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And sometimes they'll be referred to as the 4 countries of Great Britain, although no one in Northern Ireland refers to themselves as a country. The Scottish certainly do. So there's our divisions. You can see that within Northern Ireland, you have a division of north-south. And then within the Irish and Northern Sea, you have kind of an east-west division between 3 out of the 4 political entities of Great Britain and Ireland. So, 800 plus years of history between England and Ireland is not going to be covered in 15 minutes. So I'm going to skip right ahead to 1973, when the United Kingdom joined what was then called the European Community, or European Communities. That entity evolved into the European Union by 1993. For a whole bunch of nationalist, make Great Britain great again thinking, English sensibilities of pride, a lot of financial reasons, as we all know, in any political entity, not all organizations pay in the same. So in Vermont, when we have school funding, we find out that, towns like Sherburne, Killington have historically, paid in more than they've received back from the state. So England traditionally has paid in more to the European Union than they have received back. So that, I think, was part of the dialogue as well, which led to the idea of let us, Britain, exit the European Union, AKA Brexit. So that referendum took place in 2016. It passed within the United Kingdom, 52 to 48. Scotland overwhelmingly voted to remain in the European Union. The city of Edinburgh was upwards almost close to 80% stay, 20% leave. Northern Ireland also voted to stay with it, did not vote in favor of Brexit, voted to stay within the European Union, and metropolitan London did as well. So it was Wales and other cities within England and the rural areas of England. So that led to many years of negotiation as to how in the heck would we do this? Because one, it's not easy to withdraw from a political and economic trade partnership that is 40 to 50 years going. And then you have this thing called the Partition of Ireland.
Mm.
So we'll just freeze Brexit for a little bit, other than to say it all got on paper worked out such that the United Kingdom had 1 year of transition after everything was agreed to. There was David Cameron's government fell because of Brexit. Theresa May's government fell. Boris Johnson was in and out. So long story short, there was a year transition which ended on New Year's Eve just this year. So we're only about 10 weeks into the reality of the United Kingdom not being part of the market, political entity, and the trade markets of the European Union.
Graham, could I ask a question?
Sure.
All right, one of the things that you didn't mention was the religious difference between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And is it correct to say that the Northern Ireland is majority Protestant and Southern Ireland, or the Republic, is majority Catholic? Is that true?
That would be a true statement. Yep.
And that has been a running difference between the two Irelands for a very long time, right? It is also, in other words, the struggles between the two Irelands is also a religious struggle, correct?
Of sorts, sure. I mean, the Scottish Protestants, my grandfather was Ebenezer MacIver, born in Scottstown, Quebec. So I have on my mom's side a very strong Scottish Protestant background. My dad's side's very Irish Catholic. But you know, the Scots were not indigenous. The Scotch Irish were not indigenous to Northern Ireland. They were brought over. They were planted there, the Scottish planters, to create a beachhead, if you will, on the island of Ireland. But yes, so politically, you have the majority of people in the repartitioned Ulster of only 6 counties, when it was historically 9, that identify with the United Kingdom politically and have a religious affiliation of the Church of England and Protestantism.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Thanks. Thank you.
And so what other questions are there to date? So what I was going to do is just try to touch on how the peace treaty, if you will, how the Troubles, the Civil War, the IRA put down their guns, and the British, the Unionist paramilitaries put down their guns in the late 90s, and then move that into present day issues relative to Brexit and the border, both the border on the island of Ireland and the east-west border of the Irish Sea. And
Great. That'd be great.
does anybody else have any questions of anything that I've said? Ian, feel free to say that I'm giving a revisionist history or whatever.
Well, Sandy kind of put me on the spot, I guess.
No, I'm just inviting you to add.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, I grew up in England. My mother was from Scottish parenthood, and I've always identified with Scotland. And I have a nephew who lives in Wales, and so he's bilingual Welsh and
Mhm.
English. And of course, Ireland has its own language,
Right.
the Republic of Ireland.
Yeah.
And so, you know, this idea of the United Kingdom is it's almost like the United States. You know, we're still both places still somewhat fragmented. I mean, Scotland. My Scottish grandfather, the thing he was always telling me about was the Battle of Culloden Moor, which was a very significant event in
Right.
Scotland. The clan system was broken up and the English took over. I mean, the English crown always sort of struggled to maintain control of Scotland. And the Scottish Nationalist Party, which is now the strongest party in Scotland and represented in Westminster, you know, I don't think they have it anymore, but they used to have a song which goes Scots wha ha with Wallace bled, and this is a reference to William Wallace, who actually beat the English in a battle, and but was then well, it's a long story. It was considered treasonous what he did, and he said, well, it was never treason because I was never a subject of the British crown. I mean, the United Kingdom was probably reached its highest level of unity when it was part of the European Union.
Yeah.
And also Ireland. I mean, we're focusing on Ireland. Ireland, I think the Republic benefited hugely from the European Union economically, but at the same time, Ireland as a whole benefited because I think it was a major element of the Troubles. Some kind of undeclared war between the North and the Republic. All of that sort of became irrelevant, or at least manageable. So one of the big concerns, I mean, I said I grew up in England. I lived for 30 years in England, and I still read the newspapers, and I talk to my brother who lives there. So I've been trying to understand Brexit, but I think that really what it comes down to is it's a tragedy in my mind, because it's destroyed not just an element of Europe, of the European Union. It hasn't destroyed it, but it's just made it very much more difficult to trade, to travel, to do everything else between the UK and the rest of Europe, or the rest of the what's now the EU.
I'm gonna go to the Scottish Nationalist Party that you referenced, and also the Good Friday Agreement, which was formalized in 1998 after many years of negotiation, in part by Senator George Mitchell, bringing Ireland, England, and the two communities within Northern Ireland to a point where the Troubles, the war between both the communities, as well as between the British Army and the British military and politics against the nationalist Republican community, created, you know, what is now 22 years of relative peace, although the peace walls still remain between the two communities in Belfast. They're talking about maybe they'll come down in 3 years, but they're, you know, 30 feet high. They've been there to divide the two communities and keep them at bay from each other. But just in this past month, the loyalist, unionist / Protestant paramilitaries have said they're withdrawing from the Good Friday Agreement
Why?
because of Brexit.
Ah,
So Brexit, it was far too complicated on the Irish side. I have no idea what folks were thinking about how that might work, but clearly they weren't thinking about their so-called fourth entity across the sea called Northern Ireland. And today, being St. Patrick's Day, Joe Biden, who's Irish American and was obviously a longtime colleague of George Mitchell, and a longtime proponent of the Good Friday Agreement, both in his talks with Sinn Féin, which is the Republican Party throughout Ireland, strongest in the north. Their deputy leader met with, virtually with Joe Biden today, talking about the concerns that exist this very month about the really fragile nature of the peace, of the Good Friday Agreement, of the North-South borderless trade that goes on in Ireland. And also what's interesting is in 2 months, Scotland will be having their elections. So what happened as part of the Good Friday Agreement was England devolved powers to the Welsh for their parliament, devolved local control powers to the Scots for their parliament. Currently, the Scottish National Party is by far and away the largest party in their parliament. They do not have a majority. They're very close. And Northern Ireland has a parliament that was suspended for 3 years until a year ago, when Sinn Féin rejoined the government in partnership with their previous arch rivals, the Unionist DUP being the largest party of the Protestant Unionist section. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Scotland, because not only is Brexit not off to a smooth start in Ireland, the Scottish Nationalist Party is running on a platform of an independent country that would join the European Union. And if they regain their majority, which they had previous to this past election, the intention is to put up for a referendum a withdrawal of Scotland from the so-called United Kingdom. The last Scottish referendum was in 2014, and it lost 55-45. But with so many things going on since then, that will be very interesting. To Ireland, 300-mile border, which was manned heavily, womaned heavily by the British Army with electronic surveillance, helicopters, every military piece of equipment you could have. And that border went from a hard border to a soft border with the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, such that you can cross the border like you can cross the Vermont-New Hampshire border.
that easy? I mean, that easy, really?
Well, let's say it's, I don't know, Bob, why don't you weigh in? It's easier than Vermont, Quebec, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But basically, yeah, it's a line on a map, and it's not a border like it used to be and like we normally think of borders. So that trade of goods and people and ideas, north and south, how does that work in Brexit?
Yeah.
Because Europe's like, hey, you're not going to get an entrance to the European market through your borderless border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And everybody on Ireland's like, you're not putting a border back in because the war will come back. So that is the conundrum, and the conundrum has been most recently the Single Market Act, right? So if Britain is not part of the European Union, what market are they part of? Well, they created a Single Market Act of the 4 countries in the UK to have free flowing of goods, except the Europeans were like, well, that's fine, you can have free flowing goods, but you can't also have free flowing goods between Northern and Southern Ireland, because then now you're just in the EU. So what they did is they set up an east-west border on the Irish Sea, and no goods were coming in smoothly in January and February into Belfast. And the unionists went nuts and said, no, this ain't happening. We're part of the UK. So how this is going to work remains to be seen.
Can I
But
ask
there's
another question? So the Republic is part of Europe still, right?
Absolutely
Okay, and the North is still part of the UK,
correct.
and
And
Scotland
the
is
UK
part.
is not part of, and the UK is not part of the EU because of Brexit.
Exactly. Okay, so that's a problem, as you
And
say.
then Scotland's like, well, we'll see where we stand soon. We have, less than 2 months away, national elections. So it's,
So what's saying in Scotland, if Edinburgh, in the Scottish Parliament, if the Scottish Nationalist Party wins a majority, what you're saying is there's going to be another referendum on the independence of Scotland?
That's what they're saying, yes. Yeah, that's what the SNP is saying. Yep.
And you're also saying that Scotland, at least as far as anyone knows, wants to remain in Europe, right?
The Scottish Nationalist Party is very clear that there will be a referendum to be an independent country that is affiliated with the European Union.
Right.
Not
Wow.
an independent country affiliated with the United Kingdom.
Wow.
But it won't necessarily happen, or it wouldn't necessarily be honored by Westminster because,
right.
Well, Boris Johnson, Prime Minister of the UK, has said, no, we're not going to have another referendum in Scotland.
Right. Yeah. So, those are statements of intent. Obviously, Brexit was voted on in June of 2016, and it's taken 5 years just to get 7 weeks of implementation, which is incredibly complicated. So, you don't withdraw from longstanding political entities easily. And without,
but I think it's fair to say that long protracted negotiation process, the sticking point was always the problem of the border in Ireland. And that was apparently something that was never really anticipated when people went and voted for Brexit. They weren't aware of the reality of what this was doing to Ireland, and that's been the sticking point of throughout those negotiations.
Right. The partition of the island and its subsequent border, without a doubt, has been the hardest nut to crack in the very simple idea of, oh, let's have Britain exit. Be fine.
Ireland has always been a sticking point for the English, hasn't it, throughout history?
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah, I mean, yes. yeah, I mean, yes, self-determination of the Irish and their will to do that by peaceful and or other means has been an ongoing part of the history. Yep.
And it's also, it seems also part of the religious wars which consumed Europe for generations too, with the Protestant Reformation a lot, it seems to me. However, I'm not an expert in that. Okay, well, what's going to happen, Graham? What do you think is going to happen? I mean, what does this mean for England, really, also? That England is no longer in the EU, does that, I mean, there are definitely consequences for England itself. Is that right?
Sure. I mean, yeah,
Well,
a lot of consequences. Yes.
like what?
And, yeah, well, what's the viability of that of that political state?
Mhm.
You know, it's hard to, I don't know.
Mm.
I think the Scottish vote will be very telling. If it remains a 55-45 and that's not going to become an issue, that certainly makes things seemingly a little easier for the British politicians in Westminster. If the SNP, Scottish National Party, wins a majority and wins a solid one, then that'll certainly complicate things all throughout that map. So
There is a question too, Graham. Are you seeing it in the chat
in the
from
chat,
Jane? From Jane? Jane, I think she's muted and now I don't see the
yeah.
question anymore.
How
Jane.
does,
Yeah, I wanted to ask about how Brexit is affecting trade with the rest of the world, trade with the
Yeah.
trade with the rest of the world, and how has that affected? Yeah. Anyway, and yeah.
okay. Mhm. So I can share a little bit. I mean, this obviously this is far more complicated than I understand, but I can share some bits of information relative to that question. The majority of trade for Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland is with England, is with the UK, primarily with England.
Mhm.
The majority of trade for England is not within the UK. So that's there. In January of this year, trade, primarily exports, but also imports, was off 30%. Trade with the EU was 30% less this January than a year ago. Trade with the EU. So those are some of the early returns on that trade. Clearly, the United States has a trade agreement with the EU, but because this is all 8 weeks in, the United States does not have a trade agreement with the UK. They did because the UK was part of the EU. So Biden had made it clear in his campaign and again today, both to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland and the Sinn Féin Vice Chair, that there will not be a trade agreement with the United Kingdom unless the Good Friday Agreement is absolutely adhered to. We've already seen the conundrum and the tensions there. Certainly, historically, the Northern Irish Protestants have felt like, the Brits will jettison them in a minute for their own self-interests, united until we don't need to be united. So there's that concern, and at times perhaps paranoia. So that, the United Kingdom doesn't have trade agreements with anyone because it's a kingdom that is 7 weeks into no trade agreements. It has trade agreements with the European Union. That was right. That was part of the deal. But the European Union 2 days ago sued the UK over their not following the trade agreement relative to Northern and Southern Irish flow of goods. So, and Boris Johnson's like, oh, we have the ability to do that. The government of Ireland, the Sinn Féin and the SDLP, the main nationalist Republican / Catholic parties, and the Scottish National Parliament, I don't know where Wales stands on this, Scottish Nationalist Party, are all saying Westminster's in a power grab. The whole idea of these devolved local control powers, they're running roughshod over because they're saying we have to impose the free flow of goods within the UK. And yeah, this devolved stuff from 1998, that doesn't quite work so well anymore.
Okay, so the English, in other words, what you're saying is they are trying to reimpose their rule on these rather unruly peoples who regard themselves as other nationalities, as members of other nations, Scotland and Ireland, correct? And the English.
Two things, Sandy. One, the EU is suing as of this week, and the Irish government agrees with that England's not playing by the rules relative to the EU-UK trade, and the devolved parliaments, at least in Scotland and elements in Northern Ireland, are also saying Westminster is not upholding their agreement to local control devolved powers that came about in the late 90s. So both of those things have been coming to the fore just in the last month.
So
because of Brexit.
Because of Brexit. Okay, any other questions? Okay, I would like to ask, there's somebody else, there's 3 people in the chat, but I don't know who they are.
And I'd just like to say for Armando, I think the Yankees bullpen looks really weak this year. So I think the Red Sox are in good shape, Armando.
Well, that's good because and it's kind of tied because the Red Sox represent an Irish city of Boston, correct? But let me ask you something else. So what will happen in Scotland if a referendum passes for independence and it passes? What's Westminster going to do with that? First of all, what could they do if Nicola Sturgeon, who's the leader of the SNP, what if she says we're going to put this referendum on the ballot in Scotland? Do you think England will say you can't do that? And if England says you can't do that, then what?
Well, it sounds like the Catalonians putting independence on the ballot in Barcelona and saying, no, not so fast.
Right.
So,
except that the English aren't perceived as draconian as, I don't think, the Spanish, king, I guess. But nevertheless, it is kind of the same situation. If Scotland declares itself independent, what will Westminster and Boris Johnson do about it? What do you think?
Probably have a crisis and call for snap elections. I don't know. It will not be welcomed, and it will, whatever happens will not happen all that quickly.
Right.
Stating the obvious. What, a larger question might, well, who knows, will be, does Does the British, do the English citizens come to realize that this idea of Brexit actually is far more complicated and not in their self-interest as much as 52% of them thought? when
And
they
what
did-
anyway? What if the citizens, I mean, the citizens of England, if you want to call them citizens, I mean, they are still a monarchy.
Yeah,
um,
well, there
this-
you go.
Right, the citizens of England
The voters,
voted for Brexit.
right.
So what can they do now? I mean, if there's another election that says, no, we want to rejoin Europe, Europe's not going to be happy about that, I wouldn't guess. Why did they vote for it in the first place? Anybody have any ideas?
Ian, you want to weigh in on what your thought of that is?
Well, I'm not particularly close anymore to what's happening in Scotland. I mean, I read about it, but actually, if you'll allow me to just go back to Ireland, maybe Graham, you could speak a little bit about the history of Ireland, which, as I understand it, was ruled, the whole of Ireland was ruled by Britain until I think 1918 or thereabouts.
22, until 1922, right?
22. Okay, so after the First World War,
Yeah.
and that was a
Right.
result of a like a revolution or an insurrection or something in Ireland, and the British just couldn't keep control of Ireland and had to give Ireland its independence, and it became a republic, so completely independent of the British crown, with the exception of this little piece in the north, the Northern Ireland. But I mean, are we still, and of course, the history of Ireland also economically it was incredibly disadvantaged. And while Britain was ruling Ireland, they really as I understand it, exploited the agriculture of Ireland, so that there were terrible famines, and Irish people emigrated to the United States in huge numbers, and that emigration, I believe, really only stopped with the Republic of Ireland joining the European Union. So you know, Ireland is it's a different place from the UK, and with a history which you know, not surprisingly, because it was a very difficult time for Ireland when it was ruled by Britain, and subsequently. So you know, there are strong feelings in Ireland. I mean, I think maybe more so than Scotland, although you know, we've been talking about Scottish independence. That's a big movement, but Ireland has a history over the last 100 years, which really, I think, form this current situation.
Well, one thing that I wanted to bring up too is what Ian is talking about. Yes, this struggle with Ireland has been going on for a very long time, probably since the Middle Ages, really, 800 or 900, with the English trying to conquer Ireland. And that, I believe, erupted in the Civil War during the First World War, when there was a war between the Protestants and the Catholics on the island, and against England. As a result of that war, there was a compromise that was a subject of a great movie called Michael Collins. And so that war was a compromise with the Northern Irish, more Protestant part of Ireland siding with England. And then this Republic of Ireland, largely Catholic, was created independent of England. I want to point out something else. This is where the roots of the IRA, isn't it, Graham? The IRA was the Irish Republican Army. It was deemed a terrorist group by the United States. But I want to mention this because it hit me one time. It was the Irish Republican Army, which meant that it was also anti-monarchical or anti-king and queen, Southern Ireland is a republic. Northern Ireland is still under the control of the monarch. And the monarch is not terribly in favor right now anywhere, but it never has been in Southern Ireland. And so, I mean, this struggle has its roots so far back. And also the English, it seems to me, there's a large percentage of English people who've never wanted to be part of Europe in the first place. And so once again, why was it that the English voted for Brexit? Very unpopular in the
Ian, that's what I was curious on your take. So before we go there, just a couple of things. There was home rule came about in Westminster, home rule for Ireland. I think the first home rule legislation was maybe 1912. It was the fourth home rule. The third home rule passed, but it was during World War I. And that was 1918. That was 2 years after the Irish Republican Army led the Easter Uprising, which was an effort to militarily, in Dublin, overthrow and kick the British out, led to mass executions and whatnot. Subsequent to that, the British like, all right, let's get this done with home rule number 3. We'll solve this Irish problem. World War I's going on. So by 1922, finally, home rule came about, but it wasn't for Republic of Ireland. It was the Free State,
right.
which led to so it was partitioned 6 and 26. Ulster gets the 3 most Catholic counties in the north become part of the Free State of Ireland. And the 2 political parties were the different IRA political parties, the different Sinn Féin political parties that supported total independence versus those that did not support total independence. And that led to the Irish Civil War amongst the free Southern Irish, if you will. The Republic of Ireland came about 15 years later in 1937.
Okay, I think there's some people in chat. I don't know how to do it. Beth, do you? Do you know how to? Oh, yes. Beth, is she still there? Well,
Jane is asking how the Brexit affects trade with the rest of the world outside of the EU.
right. She already asked that, I think, Beth, and
Okay.
that has been discussed. There seems to be 5. I see the number 5 over.
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
Diane, did you want to jump in? You're providing some information.
Okay, all I was doing was I was checking on how long Ireland was part of the UK, Great Britain. And it looks like it was only 122 years. It's not like it went back to the Middle Ages. It goes prior to 1800, Ireland was its own independent place.
No,
That's not true?
no.
That's what history shows when I looked it up.
What?
It was probably not part of the United Kingdom because there wasn't a thing called the United Kingdom. Ireland.
Those were my words.
Yeah. Ireland was indigenous, tribal clans, much like Scotland.
Right.
By the thing is the 800-year war. So 1200s, 1300s, the Irish clans start losing their independence to elements coming over from England. It wasn't the UK at the time, but
So you're saying Ireland was intermixed with England
subjugated,
1800.
Yeah.
yeah,
what- yeah,
subjugated
right,
by,
subjugated, right.
yeah,
As was Scotland, and Scotland in 17,
Right.
I think 07 was finally subjugated by the English, maybe at the Battle of Culloden, actually, Graham, which you mentioned. And Scotland was basically at war with the English, and they won, frankly. And William Wallace was a rebel against that, but Scotland was finally, in an act of union, made part of England. But I'm not certain that the Scots ever really wanted it that way, or the Irish wanted it that way. It just kind of happened because England has always been the stronger imperial power, in fact, in the entire world, until really till until World War II.
No, that's an exaggeration because the Spaniards and the Portuguese
Yes.
were before England. So,
Right,
right.
right.
but so if you go back to Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, I
Right.
thought she was the critical link between England and Scotland.
Right. And she was Catholic also.
Right, that was the
Right,
critical piece.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So
Okay, any other, there's other people that seem to have questions or comments. No?
Well, Bob doesn't have his microphone, otherwise he'd be weighing in, but
Right, he wrote that partition happened under the threat of all-out war from England.
Right, right. And that partition was 1922, correct? 22
Yes.
or 23, right
Yeah.
after World War I, which was one of the results really also of World War I that were all over the planet. That was a very important war with numbers of borders drawn, numbers of borders changed by the victors, who were England, France, and the United States, although the United States did not play a huge part in the Treaty of Versailles as the other two did. Anyway, any other questions? To me, this is a really important subject because it also goes to, can Europe survive the exit of England and what is happening in the EU? Is it a good thing that the English got out for good for the English? Is it good for Europe? Is it damaging to Europe? I think it has really broad implications for the whole idea of keeping Europe together. Anyone else have any other thoughts? Graham, any final?
well, I mean, the plenty of, the wars in Europe weren't all that long ago.
Right,
And
right,
when you look at the European communities just in 1973 starting to come together, it's a very new concept. I was talking with a friend of mine who who was once getting a tour of Venice, or Florence rather, and he said to the tour guide, "Boy, you know a lot about Florence. You must have been here." He said, "No, my family's Venetian. We just moved here 600 years ago." He was being dead serious. So those how people identify, right? I was just in the island of Vieques off of Puerto Rico. Do not call anyone on that island Puerto Rican. They will quickly scold you and say, "No, we're Vicenses." So, right, people have a long history of identifying themselves religiously, politically, geopolitically, and those roots usurp and go over borders in many ways. So finding common ground. Climate change really doesn't care about borders, right? And the human beings working together to solve some of our human created problems are absolutely essential as people jockey to identify and try to create both their self-determination within their political states, but also hopefully we can see the commonality that we have around the precarious nature of our planet.
But I want to just say one other thing, and thank you very much, Graham, for doing this and for all you others who did enter the discussion. However, the Irish, did emigrate massively here. And I want to kind of recall to all of us on this St. Patrick's Day that the Irish were incredibly oppressed here as well in this country, largely because, I guess, because they were poor and Catholic. And the country at that time, which was probably pretty early on during the Civil War and after, the country was largely identified as Protestant. And so the Catholics really formed a minority. And I want to remind us of that because we've only had one Catholic president before Biden. That Catholic president, of course, was JFK. And do you remember, those of us who are old enough to remember the kind of prejudice that existed when John F. Kennedy became president of the United States? And this is only the second Catholic president that we've had. So this question of Ireland has been in our history as well as in the history of the UK and Europe. Any other final thoughts before we call it a day till next week? Next week, we're going to be talking about the Fourth Amendment of our US Constitution, and TJ Donovan is going to give a talk on the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment is the amendment in our Constitution that guarantees our privacy in our homes and in our bodies, by the way, that the government cannot search either without a search warrant, and that search warrant has to be granted by a judge who says there's probable cause that the government should have that authority to break into our houses and maybe into our bodies. All right, so thank you very much.
Andy, I would just invite everyone and anyone to go online to look at Greg Delanty's work. He is considered the poet laureate of the Irish in America. Greg has a long history of social justice and environmental justice, spending time with the Sioux in Standing Rock. And on this day, for all the oppression the Irish have felt, it's one of the most outwardly generous groups of people the world over, both in terms of government spending. And when you go on to the Hopi Navajo COVID GoFundMe page, you will be blown away by the fact that almost 50% of the donations come from Ireland because of the Irish oral history, knowing that the Cherokee Nation stood by them when they were being in the so-called famine, which was really just British agricultural rule. And so we have a lot to learn, I think, from the people of Ireland.
Agreed, and thank you.
Yeah, I want to just mention something. This is Lou. Greg Delanty was on, he is right now teaching a class to my roommate. He's a St. Mike's professor, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So that it was just a coincidence that we just, my roommate just came downstairs for a break, and that's what she said.
There we go.
So the paths cross.
Nice.
Anyway, thank
That's
you,
a nice,
Graham.
nice way
That was
of ending
lovely.
it, Lou. Yeah, thank you.
All of you have some Irish luck. See you later.
Yeah, good luck to us.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.